The Gilded Age. Yeah, let's talk about that. So, the Gilded Age, roughly from the 1870s to the early 1900s, was supposed to be America's golden promise, shiny factories, booming railroads, towering mansions of steel tycoons. It sounded like paradise. But for millions of immigrants arriving at Ellis Island, the reality was less gold and more coal dust. Picture this. You've just escaped famine in Ireland or political turmoil in Italy or grinding poverty in Eastern Europe. You step off the boat with nothing but a trunk of clothes and maybe a loaf of bread, and instead of a golden welcome, you're met with suspicious stares, medical inspections, and the overwhelming smell of New York's tenement districts. Ellis Island itself was a test of patience. Doctors checked for diseases like trachoma. If you blinked wrong, they marked your coat with chalk and might send you back across the ocean. Families were split. Dreams shattered before they even began. But those who passed were funneled into the industrial machine of America. Work wasn't waiting with open arms. It was waiting with open fires, sewing needles, and pickaxes. For many, the American dream translated into 12-hour shifts in dim factories with pay that could barely buy bread. Child labor was everywhere. Kids as young as 8 worked beside their parents in textile mills. The promise of freedom often meant freedom to be exploited, and yet immigrants clung to hope. Churches and ethnic neighborhoods gave them a taste of home. Whether it was a polished feast day or an Italian street procession, they were outsiders in America, but insiders in their own tight-knit enclaves. The Gilded Age glittered, yes, but mostly for the Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Vanderbilts. For immigrants, it was survival in a city that didn't want them but couldn't function without them. They built the railroads, sewed the clothes, smelted the steel, and laid the bricks for the very mansions they'd never set foot in. So let's start there with the bricks and steel. What? You thought we were gonna begin with the Industrial Revolution? Nah, that started way back in the 1700s when Britain got all up in its steam. By the time the 1800s rolled around, the Industrial Revolution had hit America like a runaway train. And by the end of the century, American cities were choking on smoke from factories and the stench from, well, everything. But this wasn't the first industrial boom. We'd seen those before. This time it was different. New inventions, new industries, new ways of making old things. And with that came a ton of jobs. Like hundreds of thousands of jobs. The only problem was those jobs weren't exactly, 5-star hotels and country club memberships. More like working in a 5-star hotel as a, let's say underpaid servant. And if you didn't like that gig, there were plenty of other options such as working in a coal mine or on a railroad crew. Oh, and don't forget the sweatshops. Those were real popular. And where were these jobs? Mostly in cities, big industrial cities with names like Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Detroit. These places became hives of industry. Steel and meat packing dominated. And if you didn't mind working long hours for not a lot of money, you could land yourself a cushy job at Standard Oil or one of the many, many department stores popping up around this time. Department stores, they were the original TikTok. Everyone gathered around to watch the latest marvel of technology, like an escalator. But wait, rewind. Where did all these workers come from? Well, some were native-born Americans, folks who'd rather work in a factory than on a farm. But as the native-born Americans trickled in, a wave of immigrants crashed through the door. And by the end of the 1800s, over 30 million foreign-born people were working in America. That's nearly 1 out of every 4 people. So now you have all these new workers flooding into cities, living in cramped quarters, breathing in the fumes of progress. Was this the golden age everyone had been promised? Not so much. I mean, the cities were growing, the factories were churning, and the rich were getting richer. But for most workers, life was tough. Wages barely kept up with inflation. And when they did rise, prices went right back up. And let's not forget about child labor. These were kids as young as 6 years old, working in dangerous conditions for next to nothing. Okay, so we've got soaring industry, overcrowded cities, child labor. Now what? Ah yes, big business. This is where the Gilded Age really earned its nickname. Big businesses like Carnegie Steel and J.P. Morgan's banks boomed like never before. Monopolies and trusts became all the rage, limiting competition and controlling entire industries. And the owners of these businesses, well, they became some of the richest people in history. Carnegie, for example, went from making $6,000 a year to over $30 million. And Rockefeller, he took his $8 a week salary to becoming the richest man in the world. So, to recap, we've got smoky cities, overworked immigrants, and fabulously wealthy business titans. Throw in some corrupt politicians and you've got the Gilded Age in a nutshell. All right, click here to keep exploring the Gilded Age, or click here to try something else. And don't forget to subscribe for more historical tales. Hey, thanks for watching. Okay, class, it's time for our latest batch of reader-submitted questions. And this one comes from Megan and a bunch of other people who all asked, how did people live in the slums? Well, I'm glad you asked, Megan and everybody else, because I have some pretty vivid memories of it. It's hard to imagine today, but in the early 1900s, a lot of big cities had slums. One example was the tenement buildings in New York's Lower East Side and Chicago's immigrant neighborhoods. Let's take a quick trip back in time to see what life was like there. You're moving into your new apartment. You've got a key, but there's no lock on the door? Oh, well, you think, at least it has windows. Yeah, right, because they do. Just don't expect much light or air to come through them. After all, each window is shared by 2 apartments, one above and one below. And if you need air, well, you can just open the door and, breathe in the sweet smell of stale sewage. It's quite a luxury to have a private bathroom, but you and 49 other families all share the same toilet down the hall. On the plus side, your apartment does have running water now, though you might want to boil it first. But what about the rats? Well, they're not too bad. Just mind your step, because there are holes in the floor and walls everywhere. If you fall through one, you might land in the family's bedroom. But that's probably nicer than where you'll end up if you fall in the neighboring apartment. It doesn't matter that it's nighttime because there isn't any insulation in the walls. Plus, your upstairs neighbor likes to practice his violin at all hours. At least he's talented. He's going to be a star one day. Your child looks up at you with innocent eyes and asks, "What's that big, bright thing over there? Is it a star?" "No, honey, it's the sun. Now come help me carry in the groceries. We should probably cook dinner before the cockroaches find something better to eat. Speaking of which, don't put that apple core on the floor. The roaches will love it." Your friendly upstairs neighbor pops by to introduce himself. He's the 3rd person to do so today. Mind if I ask how many families live here? He asks, smiling. 38, you reply, also with a smile. There's room for a few more, he says. Yep, just look downstairs. There's a family of 6 living in that one-room apartment. You remember the family you saw earlier? They must be expecting company because they're taking in boarders to make extra money. The wife is cooking dinner, probably spaghetti, and the husband is sleeping on a cot next to the children. Hey, kid, go throw the garbage out the window. Life in the tenements was tough. You never knew when a fire would break out, destroying everything you had, or when disease would strike you down. But hey, at least you weren't starving. For many immigrants, these slums were still better than the starvation they had fled. In fact, conditions were so bad that people like Jacob Riis took photographs of the tenements to show the wealthier Americans how the other half lived. So yeah, life in the slums was like that. Thanks for joining me on this quick tour of tenement life. I hope it was an experience you never have to repeat. Just kidding. Stay in touch. All right, we've talked about the mansions of the rich and the slums of the poor. Let's now discuss the factories of the Gilded Age. They were the lifeblood of the era, and the workers who powered them were mostly immigrants. We're talking Italians, Jews, Irish, Germans, Poles, all packed into textile mills, garment shops, steel plants, slaughterhouses, and coal mines. Now, why were so many European immigrants working in these dangerous places? Well, they were running from poverty and persecution, but also towards a new life. America was seen as the land of opportunity, even if that opportunity meant working long hours for low wages in terrible conditions. So what was a normal day like in one of these factories? Well, you'd get up before the sun and eat whatever you had ready because breakfast was not provided. Then you'd take the trolley or walk to the factory, arriving right around when the shift started at 6 or 7 a.m. You'd work 12 to 14 hours, 6 days a week. There was no such thing as overtime pay, and the only time off was for Sundays. The work was repetitive and often dangerous. Fingers were lost in the sewing machines, lungs filled with coal dust, and scaffolds collapsed under poor construction. But if you died on the job, no worries, your employer could just hire the next boatload of desperate workers. And don't think children were spared from this grind either. Boys hauled coal in mines, while girls stitched shirts in garment factories. In fact, child labor was so widespread during the Gilded Age that there were child labor laws passed in several states, but they were rarely enforced. In sweatshops, the work was often done by women who were paid by the piece. That meant they were paid very little, and they worked as quickly as they could to make more money. Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was one of the most notorious sweatshops of the time. On March 1911, a fire broke out and quickly spread through the factory floor. The doors were locked to prevent the workers from taking breaks, and the fire escape was so flimsy it collapsed under the weight of the workers trying to escape. Of the 500 women and girls working that day, only 36 survived. This tragedy exposed just how brutal these workplaces could be. And yet, during the Gilded Age, this was not an uncommon occurrence. There were regular fires, accidents, and deaths in factories, and the public just kind of shrugged and said, well, that's just how it is. These tragedies made some people angry, though, and they began to organize. Labor unions had been springing up since the Industrial Revolution, and now they were demanding shorter hours, better pay, and safer working conditions. They organized strikes and protests, but often those who wanted to join the union were fired and replaced. That's because during this era of rapid industrial growth, big businesses really valued efficiency and productivity. And let's face it, back in the days of the Industrial Revolution, technology was king. The more machines, the less workers were needed. The problem was that while technology and big business boomed, working conditions got worse and worse. As more and more people moved to cities, the supply of workers kept increasing, which meant that the workers were in a constant state of desperation. With so many people looking for jobs, factories didn't have to treat their workers very well. The good news is that eventually this would change. The progressive era that followed the Gilded Age was all about addressing these issues of worker safety and efficiency. We'll talk more about that in the next video, so stay tuned. Hey, thanks for watching. I'm out. They came to America for a better life, fleeing persecution, or seeking opportunity. For many, the American dream became a harsh and disappointing reality. Today we remember those who dared to come to America in search of a better life and discover why being an immigrant wasn't always easy. This is the immigrant experience. If immigrants thought hard work would buy acceptance, they were wrong. The Irish were called lazy drunks. Italians branded criminals, and Chinese immigrants faced outright violence under the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The idea that immigrants were stealing jobs also took root in the late 19th century. As more and more foreigners entered the country, some Americans began to blame them for unemployment and declining wages. Newspapers across the country ran stories with headlines like this one from the New York Times: "The invasion from China threatens to depopulate the coast." Even though it was immigrants who fueled the very industries America celebrated, they were seen by many as a threat to the American way of life. Signs in shop windows sometimes read, "No Irish need apply." To escape the prejudice and sometimes deadly riots that greeted them in the big cities, many immigrants sought refuge in ethnic enclaves like New York's Chinatown or Little Italy. These communities offered a way of life that was familiar, a culture that was comfortable, and a language that was understood. Little Italies, Jewish neighborhoods, and Irish parishes gave immigrants a chance to maintain their cultural identity while adjusting to life in America. They provided a support system that helped newcomers cope with the challenges of assimilation. And in these tight-knit communities, children could be taught the traditions and values of their parents' culture. For a time, these ethnic enclaves were havens from the harsh realities of a nation that often saw immigrants as outsiders. But as the decades passed, many of these immigrant communities faced challenges that threatened to tear them apart. Tensions grew between generations over how to balance tradition and change. Younger immigrants began to assimilate more fully into American life, adopting new customs and shedding old habits. Meanwhile, older generations struggled to preserve their cultural heritage in a rapidly changing nation. Tensions mounted as different ethnic groups competed for resources and influence within these enclaves. Gangs of Irish dockworkers clashed with Italian-owned businesses in the early 1900s. And in the 1930s, the Jewish gangster Bugsy Malone led a gang of Irish, Italian and Jewish youths in a violent campaign against rival gangs in Boston. Sometimes the friction between ethnic groups boiled over into deadly riots. In the summer of 1914, more than 1,000 people of all ethnicities were arrested after 3 days of rioting in Rochester, New York, following the shooting of a police officer by an Italian-owned grocery delivery wagon. And then there were the restrictions placed on immigrants by local governments. Many cities enacted zoning laws that limited where immigrants could live, often forcing them into crowded neighborhoods without access to basic services. In Chicago, for example, the city council passed a law barring more than 3 unrelated people from living together, effectively ending the city's supply of affordable housing and targeting immigrant boarding houses. Other cities followed suit. And in many places, the combination of prejudice and restrictive housing policies led to the destruction of ethnic enclaves as cities cleared the way for new development, leaving many immigrants homeless. In the face of these challenges, some immigrant leaders began to organize. They created institutions like banks, schools, and newspapers that gave voice to the concerns of their communities. Groups like the Italian-American National Union lobbied for political representation and equal access to opportunities. But despite these efforts, immigrants continued to face discrimination in housing, employment, and education. They were denied loans and forced to live in substandard housing. They were barred from unions, and when they were hired, they were paid less than native-born Americans. Their children were often ridiculed for their accents and customs and were sometimes not even allowed to attend school if they could unspeak English. For many immigrants, the American dream turned into a nightmare. Despite their contributions to American society, they were still seen by many as outsiders. But their story is not over. Join us next time as we continue the story of immigration in America and learn how immigrants fought back against prejudice and discrimination and ultimately changed the nation forever. Hey guys. So, in the last video, we talked about how the Industrial Revolution drew millions of immigrants to U.S. cities, but only a fraction of those immigrants wound up working in factories. Many others found work on the streets or wherever they could get it. Now, this wasn't necessarily because they couldn't get factory jobs. It's just that some people prefer the freedom of being your own boss, even if it meant long hours and hard work with little pay. For example, some immigrants sold things on the street, like newspapers, fruit, or shoe shine. Others did odd jobs like collecting and delivering laundry, working on construction sites, or taking in sewing at home. And many families relied on the work of their children who had a variety of ways to make money. One way was becoming a newsie, which is what we called kids who sold newspapers on the street. Newsboys were usually poor and often immigrant children who gathered at busy corners, shouted headlines, and tried to sell as many papers as they could for a few pennies apiece. These were not the only ways that children made money, though. They also did things like run errands for storekeepers, deliver messages, or sweep the floors in shops. Sometimes they shined shoes, but most of the time they had to do whatever they could to help their families survive. And let's be clear, when I say children, I don't mean kids who are out of school. I mean kids who are still going to school, who might spend all day at it, then come home and do the same thing all over again. For these children, school was a chance to learn to read and write so they could earn an honest living. But their lives were far from easy. As you can imagine, life on the streets was dangerous, especially for children. There was a lot of competition for work, so they had to start early and stay out late. Not only did they have to contend with the other newsboys, but they also had to deal with adult street vendors and other people trying to make a buck. Plus, there was always the threat of the police showing up. That's because street vending was a sort of unofficial part of the urban economy. In many cities, Immigrants sold food or other goods in the street or out of pushcarts without paying the fees and taxes that official vendors had to pay. That meant the police could confiscate their carts or their wares if they wanted to. So, yeah, life was kind of tough for these kids. Still, a lot of them managed to make enough money to help their families survive. And that's important to remember because we tend to think of immigrants who came to America in this period as mainly factory workers. But the truth is that they worked wherever they could find it, whether it was in a factory, a sweatshop, on a farm, on the streets, or in people's homes. In fact, there was so much work to be done in this rapidly industrializing nation that most people could find something if they looked hard enough. The problem was that a lot of the jobs paid very little. They also tended to be dangerous and exploitative, especially for women and children. Not surprisingly, then, people often turned to other means to make ends meet. Petty theft, gambling, and underground economies grew in immigrant neighborhoods. And while we might look down on these things today, we have to remember that people did what they had to do to survive. I mean, consider the immigrants living in tenement buildings. Many of them didn't even have heat or air conditioning, so people found ways to make their apartments more comfortable without spending a lot of money. They might take in boarders to share the cost of rent and food. Or they might use coal or wood-burning stoves to heat their apartments. And they might use candles or oil lamps instead of electricity to light them up. And when families did these kinds of things, it was often done in secret because most of these activities were against building codes or the rules set by landlords. So yeah, life was a constant hustle for many immigrants and their children, but they had each other and their communities to help them through tough times. And even when they had to bend the rules or break the law to survive, they were simply trying to make the best of a difficult situation. Okay, I hope that helped. If you want even more help, I've got a link to a great study guide in the description. And if you want even more help after that, I've got a link to a full-blown review packet that's guaranteed to help you get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. I've been your teacher. I'll see you next time. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started today with a thought. You ready? Here we go. Religion was often the glue that held immigrant communities together. Catholic churches for the Irish and Italians, synagogues for the Jewish immigrants, and community halls for Eastern Europeans offered more than worship. They provided social networks, charity, and a sense of belonging. Eventually, immigrants began organizing. Labor unions grew as workers realized they were stronger together. Strikes in the steel industry, garment trades, and railroads showed that immigrants weren't passive victims. They fought for shorter hours, better pay, and safer conditions, even when police broke strikes with violence. The seeds of modern labor rights were planted by immigrants who refused to be crushed by the Gilded Age machine. Okay, now let's get into the meat of today's lesson. As we begin this new Gilded Age period, it's important to understand the massive amount of immigration that was occurring at this time. Between 1880 and 1900, the United States would receive over 20 million immigrants. And just to put that in perspective, between 1860 and 1900, the United States grew from about 31 million people to nearly 76 million people. So basically half of the population growth during this time period was due to immigration. And if you want to know more about the reasons why immigrants came to the United States during this period, you should probably watch the videos on push and pull factors and the one on the transatlantic and how that worked. Those are your 2 prerequisites to get to this lesson. Also, if you need to review some of the vocabulary terms from that unit, click right here in the vocabulary wrap. It'll help you out a lot. Okay, let's do this. So, in the last video we talked about how urbanization was a big feature of the Gilded Age and how most of those cities were magnets for all of these immigrants. And since we know that cities were crowded and most immigrants were poor, what kind of living arrangements do you think they had? Well, first off, because cities were so crowded and there weren't enough housing options, most working-class immigrants lived in tenements. Tenements were rundown, poorly ventilated buildings which housed lots of families and individuals, and they were typically located in the slums of cities. Now, these immigrants didn't choose to live like this. It's just that most of them were too poor to do anything else. But this type of living arrangement led to all kinds of social problems, including widespread disease and crime. But what kept these immigrant communities from descending into total chaos? Well, in many cases it was religion. For most immigrants, their religion was the center of their cultural identity. It gave them a sense of community and belonging in an unfamiliar place. For example, Catholic churches were built in every major city to serve the growing number of Irish and Italian immigrants. In fact, by the end of the century, there were over 1,000 Catholic parishes in New York City alone. And the same thing happened with Jewish immigrants who built synagogues and with Eastern European immigrants who built community halls. And as you can imagine, these places served many purposes. They offered immigrants a place to worship, yes, but also a place to find community, a place to find support, and a place to find jobs. Since most immigrants were illiterate, these halls often served as the focal point for adult education programs. And because poverty was widespread among immigrants, these institutions often provided charity and even free medical care. Now, not all immigrants were able to find work immediately, and many of them needed financial assistance. Religious leaders, charities, and settlement houses sprang up to help the needy. Settlement houses were institutions that provided a variety of social services to immigrants, including housing, food, and education. The most famous settlement house was Hull House in Chicago, which was founded by Jane Addams. But no matter what kind of work immigrants could find, they rarely had much bargaining power. Most of the jobs they did were low-paying and dangerous, and they worked long hours. For example, women and children were employed in factories and mills, and African Americans were relegated to sharecropping or domestic service. But despite these hardships, immigrants were able to make significant contributions to American society. Their diverse cultures enriched the nation, and their willingness to work hard helped to fuel the American economy. In fact, we should look at labor unions as an example of that. Remember that labor unions were organizations that sought to protect the interests of workers. And by 1900, many immigrant workers had organized into labor unions and were striking for better wages and working conditions. So overall, while immigration during the Gilded Age brought many challenges, it also brought many benefits to American society. Immigrants contributed greatly to the nation's economy and culture, and their contributions continue to be felt today. Okay, click here to continue. We're going to talk about political machines. Click right here and I'll see you there. But by the early 1900s, many immigrant families had clawed their way into stability. Children of tenement dwellers became shopkeepers, teachers, or small business owners. Yet their parents' sacrifices, those endless hours in factories, those sleepless nights in overcrowded tenements, laid the foundation for the modern America. The irony of the Gilded Age is that while the rich flaunted their wealth in grand mansions, the true builders of America lived in the shadows. Immigrants suffered, adapted, and survived, often unnoticed. Their brutal lives weren't gilded, but their resilience was. Without them, the so-called Golden Age wouldn't have glittered at all. Learning about the immigrants who built modern America during the Gilded Age can be frustrating. We know the names of the barons of industry and the robber barons, but what about the workers who built the cities and the products that made them rich? The name Jacob Riis barely registers today, yet his 1890 expose of the horrors of immigrant life in New York City's slums helped spur critical reforms. Or consider the Chinese who built the magnificent hotels and skyscrapers of the Gilded Age, only to be barred from working in them as laws were passed specifically to keep them out. We remember Cornelius Vanderbilt, but not the thousands of Irish immigrants who toiled as his workforce on the dangerous and backbreaking projects that created the American railroad system. So let us take a moment to consider the lives of some of these forgotten people whose labor built America's Gilded Age when the Statue of Liberty was dedicated on October 28, 1886. The inscription on its pedestal read, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." But when they arrived, most immigrants found that the reality of American life was far more difficult than they had imagined. Most immigrants continued to live among other recent arrivals in ethnic neighborhoods where they could find some familiarity and some support. In these areas, which were typically overcrowded and unsanitary, There were few jobs for women and children who were expected to stay home. For men, long hours and low pay were the norm. Employers preferred to hire immigrants because they would work for almost any wage and were too desperate for a job to complain. In the North, many African Americans who had fled the South after the Civil War found themselves in the same situation as European immigrants. Living in crowded, dirty housing and working long hours for little pay. Like other minorities, they faced prejudice and discrimination. The Chinese were especially hard hit. After the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, the Chinese were no longer needed and thousands were out of work. An economic depression in the 1870s led to widespread unemployment and a panic in 1893 that left 1 out of every 4 Americans without a job. The unemployed joined the ranks of the homeless, many of whom were immigrants, sleeping in the streets or in shelters. During this time, prejudice against immigrants and minorities grew and laws were passed to keep them out. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 barred Chinese immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens and prohibited the entry of more Chinese laborers. The Immigration Act of 1885 required immigrants to pay a head tax, $10 for each person coming through a port. This was intended to discourage the entry of poor immigrants who were likely to become a public charge. But once they were here, there was no organized effort to help them, and so immigrants turned to each other. They created mutual aid societies that provided housing, food, and other necessities to those who were down on their luck. But even these organizations could not keep up with the demand. By the end of the century, conditions had improved somewhat, but millions of immigrants and their children still lived in poverty, working long hours for little pay. But they were building a new America. The very foundations of the great cities were formed by their sweat. The buildings that housed the offices of the great companies were constructed by their hands. The factories where the goods were produced that made the rich so rich were powered by their backs. Yet during the Gilded Age, it seemed as if the only Americans whose lives mattered were the wealthy. And as we remember the great industrialists of the age, we must also remember the forgotten millions who built their fortunes. Thank you for watching.